Hi guys, this is Andrew Burgess for NetTuts, and this screencast is Chapter 5 in our Ruby for Newbies screencast series. So in this screencast, we're going to look at iterators and blocks. So let's jump into that right away. Let's pop a terminal open here. Whoops. Okay, so we have our terminal open, and I'll hop into IRB. Now, what we're going to talk about first is let's look at iterators. Or actually, we're going to first look at blocks. Blocks are a really cool feature that are part of methods in Ruby, and iterators are methods that use that block feature. So to refresh your memory, let's say we got name here, and we'll just say Joe. Calling a method, there are 5 parts to calling a method. So we have the name, we have the object, in this case name, or the receiver of the method. We have the dot, and then we have the method name. In this case, we call reverse, and you can see here we get EOJ, which is the reverse of name. We can also call them with parameters. So we can say name dot concat, and we can say the plumber, and there you can see we have Joe the plumber. So we've just concatenated this parameter, the plumber, onto our name Joe. Now, obviously, you may remember from last time, as we discussed, that parentheses around our parameter list is optional. And as you can see here, concat actually does change these strings, so that's what we have, Joe the plumber, the plumber. The parentheses around the parameter list are optional, and we're going to look at when they're required in this lesson later on. But first, for blocks. The way a block works is like this. So, well, let's first set up an array. We'll just call it sites to, so we'll just go like this. Sites equals net PSD and mobile. And then we're going to say sites.each. Now, each is a method of sites. And the way it works is we're going to go like this. And I'll write it out here, and then I'll show you how it works. So we'll say puts. Alright, so you can see here we've got this output here, nettuts plus, PSD tuts plus, and mobile tuts plus. What have we done here? Well, we've taken advantage of the block, which is the 5th part of a method call. The first part is the object, or the receiver, as we saw in this case. That would be sites. The second part's the dot. Third part is the method name. The 4th part is also optional, and that is the parameter list. We don't have any in this case. And the 5th part is the block. Everything in this case between do and end. We use the do and end keywords quite frequently in Ruby. And this is one of those places where we use them to delimit a block. We can also, so what I'll do here is let me just open Vim here so you can kind of see it in color if I get the syntax highlighting working here. So we have our array there, and let's just change the desktop, and then we will save this file. We'll just call it 5.rb for now, because this is the 5th lesson. And you can see there that we have our syntax highlighting. Alright, now let's rewrite what we just had. So we say sites each do site, and I'll just put an extra space there just to space things out here so you can see exactly what's going on here. Okay, so we have the block, which is everything between do and end. I should mention that you use do and end when you're using a multi-line block. If we were going to put this all on one line, we could do sites.each and use the curly braces, which does exactly the same thing. And that's kind of a shorthand view of what we would do above, but we can use curly braces. Curly braces, of course, can be used on multi-lines as well, but do and end cannot be used on a single line. After do, we have the block parameters. All the block parameters go between these two pipes, and it's a list of parameters just like a normal method, so we can have as many parameters as we want, just like that, separated by commas. And then we have the code inside the block. In this case, we just have one line, but we can have as much as we want, and it's just regular, normal Ruby code. Of course, you can take advantage of the block parameters just like you would inside of a normal Ruby method. Alright, so what exactly did this each method do? If we go back to the console here, you can see that it output these 3 lines of code, just like we told it to, put string, and it put those out. And then what was returned from each function? the very same array that we started with. So that each function just returns the same array that it starts with. We can also use each with a hash here. If we just say hash, we can just say name equals Joe. We can say age equals 20. So we have a hash there, and we can say hash dot each. We'll use the curly bracket syntax in this case, and then we can say have two block parameters, key and value, and inside we can just say puts. We can put key is val, and here you can see we get name is Joe, age is 20. So that's another way of iterating. Or you can see we can use each again in this case, and that means each is just a method that is on our hash class. So let's look at another method on the array class. We have that sites array here. We have that method with sites. We could do sites.map, and the difference between sites.each and sites.map is that map is going to return us the return values from the block. And so this shows us how we can return values from the block. So inside the block we can have as much code as we want, of course, but the last line is going to return to the method its value for that array. So here we can say we'll say tutsplus.com, and then we end that, of course. And now notice, instead of the normal array of sites net psd mobile that we got returned when we use each, we have nettutsplus.com, psd.tutsplus.com, and mobile.tutsplus.com returned in an array. This isn't our sites array. As you can see, if we go print out sites, it's just what it used to be. Sites.map returns an array of the values returned from the block. So where we once had net, now we have nettutsplus.com, etc. So you can see how we can return values from the block in that way. Now, let me take this opportunity to talk about Ruby methods that have an exclamation point at the end. So in this case, if we just add this here, what we did there, we say do site, and we return, actually we didn't put it, so you see we just return, because remember the final line, just like in methods or statements that are really expressions in Ruby, we have right here sites.map. So this returns an array with these values in them, as we just saw. If we put an exclamation point here, it's going to return an array with all those things in it, but that array is actually the sites array. This is not a feature of Ruby so much as it is a convention of Ruby programming. So there are two types of methods that Ruby objects have. Ones that modify them, and ones that modify the object you call the method on, and ones that return a new copy of the method. Ones that return a new copy of the object based on the original object that are just kind of altered a bit. So what you see there is map. When we have a regular map method here, it returns a new array that is based on the sites array that we started with. If we put that exclamation point there, it returns a new array. The map exclamation point method does the very same thing, except it changes that sites array into the array of the objects into the array of the values we return. Now, it's important to note that this is just a convention. In the Ruby code, there are two methods on the array. In the array class, one is a map and one is a map bang method, and one of them is what's called destructive, where it actually changes the object, and the other one is not, in that it just returns a modified version of that object. This is just a convention, and you can do the same thing in your code. I should also point out that not every method that changes the object it's part of has an exclamation point. It really depends on the name of the method, where if the name of the method assumes that you have to change it, otherwise the name doesn't make sense. For example, if you have strings, if we go here back to the terminal, you can see, we have that name method there. We can say name dot replace, and we'll replace it with hi. And now name equals hi. Replace doesn't have an exclamation point because if we're just creating a new string object, replace doesn't make sense. How can you replace a string with a totally different string object and not change the first one? When you're replacing the contents of a string, you're replacing that string. And so that's why replace doesn't have an exclamation point. But that's just kind of a side lesson here within our main lesson on blocks. Let's get back to blocks here. So we have exclamation points. Another interesting iterator is the times method that numbers have. So you can see here, if we do this, and we can just say puts loop, and then we'll just put out how many times the loop is going around. And I use the curly brace method, so we have to, instead of square brackets, so you've got to keep with whatever you're using, of course. And I'm going to do it again, and there we go. And so you can see we have loop 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in this case, the block parameter is just the time that we're going around in that loop. So we obviously can't go over every method that uses blocks in kind of the standard Ruby core and the standard library. But what I've shown you here is kind of how it works so that you can go ahead and implement, or at least so you can go ahead and understand when you're reading documentation or looking at other people's Ruby code, you can understand exactly what a block is and what the different pieces of it are. So now, instead of going on to look at a whole bunch of other methods that implement the blocks, let's talk about creating our own methods that use blocks. And since all the simple ones have really been created, are built into Ruby, we're going to make we're just going to duplicate one of those. So I'm going to open up the array class here, and we're going to define the each2 method. Before we do this, I should mention that iteration is not the only use of blocks. Block is really just a way to pass code into a Ruby method. It's kind of a bit of meta programming in that you're programming while you're using the API, but it's and in that way it's kind of different from anything I've ever seen in any other language. But don't think that it's inherently iterating. For example, I haven't actually looked at the code behind Sinatra, which is a great Ruby web framework that is so fun to use, and that we're going to get to in a couple of lessons. But I believe it uses blocks. I haven't actually looked at the code behind it, but from the code you write, I'm pretty sure you're writing blocks of code off methods. So for example, here, let me just show you. Down here, it's actually writing web requests, so you might do something like this. And then in here, you're going to write some code, something like this. And this uses, I'm pretty sure it's a block. Off the get method, we pass it one string parameter, and then you have your block. And there's no iteration at all going on there. That is simply a way of passing code to the method. So don't think that blocks have anything to do with iteration. However, in the examples we're going to write right now, we're going to code right now that use blocks. It's just going to be for iteration. All right, so let's write this each method. Well, what does the each method do? It iterates over each element in the array and passes it to the loop. It passes it to the block, and then at the end it returns itself. So we know it returns itself, so we can put that at the end, because remember the last statement in a Ruby method is the return value. We could put return if we want to, but we don't need to. So we're going to loop. Let's use a while loop. So we're going to say I equals 0. Then we're going to say while self I. Let's end that while loop. And in here, we're just going to say I plus equals 1. So basically, while there's a value left in the array, in here, we're going to do something with it, add 1, and keep going. So what do we do here? Right here is where we need to access the block that is passed to the each method. And we do that with the yield keyword, if I can spell it right. Now the yield keyword, I don't think it's actually a method call, but it looks very much like a method call because after it we pass whatever values are supposed to correlate to the block parameters. So in this case, it's self I, which is going to be the current value in our array. So let's give this a try. Down here, we'll just stick with our previous example. We'll say net PSD and mobile, and then we say sites.each2 do. We'll just use the parameter s, and of course that block parameter can be whatever you want it to be. And then we'll just say puts s dot tutsplus.com. And if we come back here, I'm going to have to exit this. Let's clear that and move to the desktop. And then we will execute this. And you can see we get those three things put out. So our each2 method is working. All right, let's try and modify this to be the map method. Well, what's different about the map method? The difference between the map method and the each method is that the map method returns a new array, which is an array of the values returned from the block. So that means we need to capture those. So we'll call this, we can call this block returns. And of course you could call this whatever you want. And down here, we're going to have to return those block returns. But the question is, how do we capture the value that is returned from yield? And it's very easy. Just capture it as if it's a normal method call. So we say block returns I equals yield. And so down here, let's change this to map2. And I'll just take this part off here so that we're not putting out. And then I'll just say print sites, and actually sites2 is what we'll have to say, because remember map doesn't change our original one. So that means we'll have to catch in here, sites2. Then I'll just put out that to kind of put a line break. All right, let's try this. And here's our array. And the reason I used print instead of puts is if I used puts, we would just get the same kind of, or put s, it would just print out each of those on separate lines. So you wouldn't be able to really see that it's an array. But you can see here that with print, you can see that sites2 is indeed an array that is kind of based off our sites array, and it has been changed. Let's try the exclamation version of sites. And you can see with this, what we can do is we're still going to return self, but instead of block returns, we're just going to reassign the current value of self. So self I equals yield self I is how we can do that. And now we don't even have to do this. We can say map to bang and print that out like that. We'll leave that. And now, unexpected keyword end on line 11. I somehow got rid of the while line while I was here, so we can say while self I. And now that should be fun, and you can see here that sites is actually being changed. I should point out that there's no blocks are actually optional. And so let's try that right now. Let's make a method. We'll just define a random method here. We'll just call it a block method, just for want of a better name. And we will say if block given puts block given, we'll just say else, and let me just indent this for our easy reading. Else puts no block given. And of course we have to end that. Down here, let's call block method. And if we come back here, you can see we have no block given, but if we put a block here, we don't even have to put anything in the block, really. And you can see we get the word block given. And it should be obvious to you by now that the block parameters are not required. They're optional. As you can see, you can easily write a method without block parameters. Okay, let's discuss one more thing before we finish here. We're going to discuss parentheses on your method calls. As we've discussed previously, you know that parentheses on your method calls are optional sometimes. So when are they required? Well, they're required in two cases. They're needed in both cases because of the block feature of Ruby. So let's look at this method call. We have object.sum method, then we have a parameter, and then we have a block here that, does something. We'll just say code here, and then we close that. Okay, this would fail in Ruby. And why would it fail? Because when you use curly braces, it gets kind of complicated here, but there is technically a difference between using the do end keywords to delimit your block and the open close curly braces to delimit your block. And this is one of those cases where it's not exactly the same. Putting curly braces in this case, Ruby assumes that this block is the block of this parameter, not the block of the method. If we use the do and end keywords in this place, it'd be fine. And it would pass param to some method and use this as the block. However, if you use curly braces, it's required that you put the parentheses around the parameters of the method so that the Ruby engine doesn't get confused between the parameters in the block and who the block actually belongs to. Using the do and end keywords are a fine solution to this. I actually prefer them. They look more Ruby-like. I like how Ruby requires very little punctuation. And it's mostly just characters, like alphanumeric characters. However, it's up to you if you want to use curly braces or if you're trying to put something on one line and curly braces are required. Just make sure you put parentheses around those parameters. The other case is, let's say we have an array here and we do push. We're going to push a hash in here where name equals Andrew. Ruby doesn't realize in this case that that hash is a hash. It's executing, it's interpreting this code array. That's fine. That's the receiver. Dot push is the method. Open curly brace. Aha! A block is what Ruby says. It doesn't realize that this is the opening parenthesis. This is the opening curly brace to a hash. It thinks it's the opening curly brace to a block. So if you have a hash as like a raw hash like this, if our hash was up here in a if we had a hash variable here and we were just putting hash in like that instead, that'd be fine. However, when you're putting in a hash literal, that's when you have to be careful, because if it sees that opening curly brace and it thinks that we're starting a block instead of starting a method call. And so this is where it's required to have curly brace, or I'm sorry, it's required to have parentheses. Now, if instead of that we have a string here as our first method, or I'm sorry, as our first parameter, you don't need to have the parentheses. And as a bonus, you don't even need to have the curly braces around your hash if the hash is the last parameter of the parameters, or like if the hash is the last parameter passed to that method. So this right here is a valid method call, and inside array.push, in this case, of course array.push isn't the right method here, but if it was array.something else, we get two parameters here. The first is a string and the second is a hash with one key, name, and the value Andrew. And so those are the two cases where you need to have parentheses on your method calls. Well, that's the end of our lesson for today. In review, we've discussed method calling. The 5 parts of a method call are the object or the receiver, the dot, the method name, the parameter list, which is optional, and the block, which is also optional. We've discussed how blocks work and how most blocks, or many methods that use blocks are iterators, and how that works. And we saw how to build a few and use the yield keyword. One more thing before we go, it's our Ruby resource in which I point out a usually free resource for your consumption. In this case, I recommend that you check out ruby-doc, ruby-doc.org. This is the official documentation for the core API and the standard library that come with Ruby, and it's a really good source when you're trying to figure out exactly how a Ruby method works. I should note that you really don't even have to go to the site. A lot of the time you'll just Google, Ruby array collect, or, Ruby string reverse, something like that. And ruby.org will be one of the top options that come up in your search results. And you can know that that is a great trusted resource. And you can check out the site. They've got some other stuff here, some getting started guides, that kind of thing, where you can just browse to whatever method you want from right here. You don't even have to search for it. Well, that is all I've got for you today, folks. Thanks for coming along for the ride. This has been Ruby for Newbies Chapter 5 on blocks and iterators, and we'll see you next time.